Greetings from Tempe. My name's Brian Brayboy, and I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe and director of the Center for Indian Education. I want to welcome you to our webinar series. I'm really thrilled with what the team has put together over the coming months as we begin to do this. So let me tell you how we got here. A few years ago, we started planning the 60th anniversary for our center. And as we emerge into our 61st and then our 62nd year, in the midst of planning for this, we had a global health pandemic that exposed many other things along with it as well, which really forced us to rethink what we wanted to do. And while we wanted to gather in person, it did not seem the prudent thing for us to do. But we also didn't want to miss a Diamond Jubilee. How many research centers actually celebrate a 60th anniversary? So we decided we were going to do this series of webinars and conversations that are really focused both on the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous education. And so that's how we ended up here. I'm really glad that you have decided to join us for one or all of these. They're going to be exciting and interesting, and I know that the team has put a lot of thought into them. Let me back up again. I am coming to you from Tempe, which sits on the ancestral homelands of the Acamel-O'odham and Peepush peoples. There were certainly other communities, other tribal communities and peoples who utilized the space because of the verdant river that was really flowing through here, that flowed all the way to the Sea of Cortez. So we're coming to you from that and recognize that with this recognition, there's a certain level of responsibility that the institution has to those peoples. And in some ways, that's where the Center for Indian Education comes in. We were founded in 1959 at the time to really try to meet the educational, cultural, and social needs of tribal communities and children. And to be perfectly honest with you, 61 years later, that's precisely what we intend to do. Our scope is widened. We serve the 22 tribal nations and communities in what is now the state of Arizona, but we have partnerships across the U.S., and we've got partnerships in Canada and in New Zealand and Australia and other places that are emerging. So we have gone global in some ways, but really our heart is in Arizona and in the U.S. in terms of the work that we do. We continue to want to serve the educational, social, and cultural needs of tribal communities. Importantly, our job is to work with those communities to create futures of their own making. We don't determine what those futures are. What we have is a particular capacity to be able to do research, to write policy, to think about other kinds of work, and we bring those assets to communities in service to them. It is one of the unique hallmarks of our center that has been around for 61 years. We host the Journal of American Indian Education, which is now it's about to enter into its 60th volume year, which is a pretty remarkable thing. We set policy, we write policy papers for different organizations, some affiliated with tribal governments, some with the federal government in the U.S., others for private foundations, and others for scientific organizations. We train students, we prepare Indigenous students to go out and create a future of their own making, but many of them are focused on also making meaning and making futures for their own tribal nations. That's a really important piece of what we do. And as I said, we publish the journal. So we are focused on research, policy, and publication, and remain doing that, and really hope that we will do that for the next 60 years as well. I've had the pleasure of being the director of the center, co-director or director of the center since 2009, and we'll look forward to transitioning at some point in the near future. Without any further ado, I want to thank our sponsor, the Spencer Foundation, for their generous support being able to do this work. And I'm really just so excited about the work that and the webinars that you will be engaging in. So welcome take care of yourself, and looking forward to when we can gather again in person. Take care. I want to introduce to you my boss, the 16th president of Arizona State University, Michael M. Crow, who's going to give us some words of welcome. A center like ours that's been around for 61 years has to have had a good foundation, which we've been lucky to have, really solid leadership over the years, which we've been really fortunate to have, institutional support, which we continue to have to this day, and really strong leadership from the institution. President Crow continues that work for us, having a president who understands what sovereignty is, the importance of indigenous peoples in a particular place, the importance of place and education, and the intersections between schooling, education, and place is so crucial to our success. So without further ado, President Crow.
Hi, Michael Crow here, President at ASU. I just want to congratulate the Center for Indian Education on its 60th anniversary. This is a wonderful part of our institution. This is a wonderful moment in time, recognition of now moving into the 7th decade of energy and activity. This is the oldest Indian Education Center of its kind. We're very proud of all the things it's been able to do. We're working with 22 tribal nations and very excited about that. We're working with global partners, indigenous peoples around the world. We produce teachers, we produce researchers, we create new knowledge, we do research, we generate policy ideas, we generate thinking. We work to move forward Indian peoples and Indian nations to the level of attainment that has been denied through much of our history in the United States. And it's just been something that we've got to work at completely. And I just want to say congratulations on 60 years of effort. Congratulations.
So welcome to the first webinar. I want to just introduce to you our moderator, Teresa McCarty. She is the George Sneller Professor of Anthropology and Education at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. Professor McCarty is a cultural anthropologist who is interested in and has really driven the field in language policy and planning. She has written or edited numerous books, hundreds of articles and book chapters. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and a member of the National Academy of Education. Between 2009 and 2011, she was co-director of the Center for Indian Education. She has been a longtime mentor and friend of mine, and we feel so lucky that she is part of this conversation. So thank you, Professor McCarty.
Thank you, Dr. Brayboy, for your introduction and your leadership in making the celebration of 60 years of Indigenous excellence, which looked impossible just a few months ago, a reality. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar celebrating the ASU Center for Indian Education's 60th year and all that it represents for the field of Indigenous education. I want to thank members of the CIE 60th Planning Committee, and in particular, CIE Assistant Director, Dr. Colin Ben, ASU's multimedia journalist, Taylor Nota, and CIE Indigenous Education Graduate Director, Dr. Deborah Chadwick, who will be reading the questions from the audience during the QA. And thanks to all of you who are live streaming. We appreciate you helping to launch this historic series. You can submit questions and comments to the chat, or for those watching on ASU Live, please submit questions to the School of Social Transformation YouTube website, ASU SST YouTube, where the top window has the title of this event and live. I want to honor the physical and cultural landscape that I'm speaking from, the homeland of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. In Spanish and English, this place is known as the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. We're grateful to work with and for the Indigenous peoples of this place. It's my profound honor to introduce the panelists you're about to hear. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will initially speak. We'll have a few opening questions to which each panelist will take about 5 minutes to respond. Then we plan some rich back and forth dialogue amongst the panelists with time for QA at the end of the webinar. Dr. John W. Tippecanock III, a member of the Comanche Nation and part Cherokee, is currently teaching courses in American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos. He began his education career as a fourth grade and middle school math and social studies teacher. He came to ASU in the 1970s, serving as CIE director from 1976 to 1984. That's when I first met him, and as you'll see, there's a genealogy in this webinar series. Dr. Tippecanock has been a founding mentor in that genealogy. From ASU, he went on to lead the American Indian Leadership Program at Penn State University and to serve as Director of Education for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Director of Indian Education for the U.S. Department of Education. He also served as Vice President of what was then called Navajo Community College, the first tribal college in the United States, now Diné College, and was a founding governing board member of Comanche Nation College. Those of us who've been privileged to know Dr. Tippecanock over the years often refer to him as the Dean of Indian Education. He served as president of the National Indian Education Association twice, been recognized with their Indian Educator of the Year Award, been named a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and recognized by the Comanche Nation for his seminal education work. He's published widely on American Indian, Alaska Native education, including a much-awaited forthcoming volume on Indian Ground, the Southwest. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Tippecanock back home to the Center for Indian Education. Dr. Octaviana Trujillo, the first chairwoman of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, is the founding chair and professor in the Department of Applied Indigenous Studies at Northern Arizona University, where she teaches courses on tribal nation building. And here the genealogy comes together again, for Dr. Trujillo and I were graduate students together in Professor Tippecanock's Indian education courses at ASU, and later colleagues in the same department at the University of Arizona. Dr. Trujillo returned to ASU in 1997 to lead the Center for Indian Education, where she was a prolific grant writer, building the center's teacher professional development programs and launching the Journal of American Indian Education to the World Wide Web. Dr. Trujillo has been incredibly active in Indigenous nation building and human rights. She established the first tribal education department for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, led a partnership between the Pascua Yaqui tribe and the Bedouin community in Israel, developed community health outreach programs and programs on climate research, and she serves on the Alliance of Indigenous Peoples Without Borders, whose mission is to protect and affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-government, sovereignty, sacred sites, and unrestricted movement across international borders. She's widely known as an international expert and advocate for Indigenous human rights. She's been recognized with awards from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Smithsonian Institute, and is currently leading an international project on Native American health disparities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Octaviana Trujillo. Dr. K. Chanina Lama Weima, Muskogee Creek, is an interdisciplinary scholar of Indigenous studies, anthropology, history, and political science. She's currently Distinguished Professor of Indigenous Education in the School of Social Transformation at ASU, where she specializes in the interaction between sovereign Native nations and federal Indian education policy. Her interdisciplinary scholarship can be traced to her undergraduate work. She was an art and a pre-med student at DePauw University, and she went on to earn undergraduate and graduate degrees in anthropology at the University of Arizona and Stanford. Her dissertation became an award-winning book. They called it Prairie Light, the story of Chilocco Indian School. Dr. Lama Weima is known for her insightful research on Indian boarding schools, reflected in a 2018 special issue of the Journal of American Indian Education, which she edited, Indian Boarding Schools Before and After. So more genealogy. I first met Dr. Lama Weima when she took a faculty position in American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona and got to work closely with her as co-author of our book, To Remain an Indian, Lessons in Democracy from a Century of Native American Education. Dr. Lama Weima chaired UA's American Indian Studies Department from 2005 to 2009, when she also co-founded the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, serving as one of its first presidents. She's the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award for American Indian History and has been inducted into the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. K. Chanina Lama Weima. So let me contextualize briefly the discussion you're about to witness. The year was 1959. What is now known as Arizona had been a U.S. state for only 47 years. More than 22 Native nations had occupied these lands since time immemorial. The U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education outlawing racial segregation in public schools was 5 years old, with not a trace of school desegregation on the horizon, particularly in Indian education. A cascade of bills to terminate tribal sovereignty and seize more Indian land churned through Congress, and the federal government had launched a coercive Indian relocation campaign. In 1959, ASU had just changed its name from Arizona State College to Arizona State University. It would be some years before the civil rights and American Indian movements got fully underway. So it was a time of entrenched racism and colonialism, but also a time to dream and to act. This is the context in which Dr. Robert A. Russell Jr., his wife, Ruth Russell, Dene, Native leaders and grassroots tribal citizens established what would become the first Center for Indian Education Research, Teaching, and Outreach in the United States. Robert Russell and one of the center's first students, Dr. Peterson Zaw, who would go on to become the first Navajo Nation president, wrote this about the center's mission: Indian Communities in Action for Indian Education Self-Determination. Each center director has taken up this charge in distinct but complementary ways. We're now going to hear from two of them and a leading historian of 20th century Indian education. So I'll begin by asking each of the panelists to take about 5 minutes to address these two questions. What would you identify as the greatest challenges in American Indian Indigenous education when you were the CIE director and/or when you were doing your initial work in Indian education? And what would you identify as the greatest opportunity or opportunities at that time? Dr. Tibakanek will start with you, followed by Dr. Trujillo and Dr. Lama Weima. Welcome.
Madanawika. Hello, everybody. I come to you from Southern California. I am on the traditional territory and homeland of the Lisenyo Peaquichin people. I am near the communities of Pachanga and Paula in California. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. And let me get to the question about the greatest challenges and some of my initial work. Dr. McCarty mentioned some of my initial work, in teaching boarding school at Tuba City, working at Navajo Community College. But really, it began before that because I grew up on a small Navajo reservation near Albuquerque, New Mexico, called Canyacito at that time, Tahajali now. And it was truly a community school for the people there. And I got a real good education for that experience along with my parents who were educators there. I came to the Center for Indian Education in 1976 to become director. There was a lot going on. You know, the 1960s, the 1970s were quite active periods in Indian affairs in general and Indian education in particular. You know, we were moving from a policy of termination to self-determination. We wanted more involvement, not just involvement, we wanted more control over Indian education. We wanted to practice our sovereign rights when it came to education. A lot was happening, as I mentioned. You know, Rough Rock Demonstration School, Navajo Community College, Dene College was founded. The Bilingual Education Act took place. The Kennedy Report came out in 1969, you know, which was very critical of Indian education and labeled it as a national tragedy and a challenge for both BIA and public schools. They made 60 different recommendations on how they thought it should be improved. The National Indian Education Association was formed. There were leadership programs at ASU and Penn State, Minnesota, and Harvard to prepare leaders in Indian education. The Indian Education Act was passed in '72. Tribal colleges grew. AHEC was formed. The American Indian Policy Review Commission took place. Then AIS academic programs around the country grew. So there was a lot going on and more things were happening. Now, what were the challenges? When I came to the Center for Indian Education in 1976, as I mentioned, there was just a lot going on. And so the thinking was, well, what can we do? What can we do if Indian education is a national tragedy, as the Kennedy Report mentioned? What can we do to improve the quality of Indian education for students, communities, and for our tribes? And what can we do as a program at a mainstream institution, ASU, an institution that offered limited support for our program at that time? And I always believe that education is about people. You know, people make the difference. It's people business. And they can make a positive difference if we prepare people in a way that they're knowledgeable about what it means to be an Indian educator. The Center for Indian Education, when I got there, was in existence for 17 years. They had a strong academic program. They taught courses, degrees were offered. They served as a resource and service to Indian communities around the state and even out of state. There was an annual Indian Education Conference. The Journal for American Indian Education was there. So how do we take advantage of these kinds of opportunities? The first thing I thought we need to do was just to view Indian education in a broader context. You know, what was happening in Indian education to increase the awareness and participation at the local, state, and national levels. So we had that conference. We utilized that conference to do that kind of thing, and to position CIE to take advantage of opportunities that were provided for us. So we did take advantage of grants that were offered through the Indian Education Act, Bilingual Education Act, and served as a service center for Indian people. I know my 5 minutes is about up, so I better stop here. But let me just say it was a very challenging time. It was an exciting time. It was a time to grow and build upon the foundation that was there before us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Tipakonik. We'll turn it over to Dr. Trujillo now.
You're muted, Octaviana.
It always happens to us, doesn't it? Yosem Chanea, buenas tardes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be with all of you today, this very significant milestone for the Center for Indian Education. I am here in Tucson, Arizona, the traditional homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pascua Yaqui tribe of Arizona, the Weima, the Yaqui. I'm very pleased that we were all able to gather today. 1959 was when I started public school for the very first time in Guadalupe, Arizona, a small Yaqui village, a stone throw away from Arizona State University, less than 5 miles. I went to school for the first time, and all the students looked like me, and we had someone at the front of the room that did not look like us. She was speaking in a foreign language, or a language certainly that was not from our community, and we could not understand her. I think from that first experience, I just motivated myself to learn English and to really persist, to become resilient, and become a teacher, and to return back to my community, which I did in 1976. Interesting how this all kind of is an interesting way of reflecting on what we have done as Native educators. Also interesting, at the time that I went to Guadalupe School, which is now called Frank School, it was a segregated school. It was a segregated school, and it was not until I went to college, to the university, that it was desegregated. So there's a lot of history right there in Tempe at Arizona State University of what has happened since Native educators, Native education came into the fold. When I became center director, I really had a lot of mentors like Dr. John Tepekanik and others who really laid that wonderful foundation for us to be Native educators and to really look at good policy development. If we really were going to be serving Native communities, both in the urban area as well as the rural reservation areas. And we did. But there were challenges at the time that I came to ASU. No longer did we have so much funding from the federal or state government to fund Native education or bilingual education, for that matter. That was a time where federal policy and attention to our special populations was not as strong as it was in the 60s and 70s, because you have to recall there was a movement at that time. And so the greatest challenge I had was, how are we going to keep doing what we have been doing? And so it's very important for the university community to really know why the center was very important. We had a sunset review, because if you're not performing as a research independent center, you can go away. You know, the administrators can say, okay, why are you still relevant? Why are you important? Why do we need you? So with the few colleagues that were working with us at that time, we were able to produce a sunset review document, and we were able to add from the state line another position. And that one position was very helpful, because it really helped us in really looking for external funding, to really say, yes, we can stay, we are meaningful, we still are needed, and we need to be very much part of this academic community, but also to the greater community. It was very important for us to do the outreach. During my tenure there, we were able to connect with the Indigenous communities that were close to us and throughout Arizona. We were able to bring back a major grant to really start working with students that wanted to become teachers. We worked with graduate students who wanted to become professors, because we had a doctoral studies program that we provided stipends for. We were able to even get a FIPSE award, which was very competitive at that time, to really say we need to really change policies at the state level so that we can be listened to and the needs of Native children addressed at all public schools, K-12, higher education, which included the tribal community colleges and universities, as well as the public community colleges that we have throughout the state. So the opportunities were enormous because there were those, both Native and non-Native, our friends, our colleagues, tribal leaders that came to really support the work of the center, to make sure that we were not going to be left behind, that we would have a seat at the table to make decisions for our own destinies as Native people. And I think this was such a tremendous opportunity for all of us, and that particular year that we were trying to pull all these little pieces together to really make a big statement for why we needed to be a major center on campus. We were recognized by the Native American community of Phoenix during their Native Recognition Days. ASU Center for Indian Education was given a very wonderful award for community service for that outreach. So I'm very proud of that. Thank you.
And Dr. Lama, Weima, do you want to put this in historical context based on your research?
Well, thank you so much, Terry. Like Dr. Trujillo, I come to you from the homelands of the O'odham, the OMA, and over the millennia, this place was home, at least permanently or for a while, to many, many Native peoples, Apaches, even Hopis. It's a very rich cultural and historical environment that we have the opportunity to work out of. I was never a director of CIE, and my work is a little different in that I'm a historian. So I'd like to speak briefly from a period of time at the turn of the last century, the early 20th century, when my grandmother, as a Creek woman, was struggling to raise 3 children alone, and local, state, and federal authorities intervened. And my dad, Curtis Thorpe Carr, and his brother, Robert Carlisle Carr, were actually placed at Chilocco Indian Agricultural School under the application of their parole officer. They were at that time, I guess you would say, wards of the Wichita Juvenile Court. And I say that in such detail because the status of Native people at that time was quite, from a federal, legal, and political perspective, pretty murky. We had been designated wards as individuals in domestic dependent nations, as Native nations or tribes. And that meant almost a complete lack of rights, certainly of legal rights. And that status of wardship meant that you had no rights as the kind of rights we expect as citizens. You were completely under the bureaucratic control of the federal government. And this is really an important point. We often think of Congress and legislation and laws governing Native lives, and that's true and it's important. But our status of wards meant we were under bureaucratic control of the Office of Indian Affairs, later the Bureau of Secretary of Interior. And those agencies, their rules are not like congressional legislation. Their rules are not reviewable by the courts. There's no appeal to the courts when the Office of Indian Affairs asks the question in 1893, do Native parents have any right to say where their kids go to school? Browning ruling. The answer was no. Native parents had no rights over their children. And in fact, Native parents were treated as wards, as legal minors, as children by the federal government. So that landscape has changed dramatically. Some of those challenges are still in place, but our status as citizens, at least theoretically, since the 1924 U.S. American Indian Citizenship Act, those rights actually became real through the processes that Dr. Tippecanoe and Dr. Trujillo have been talking about, through the actions and activism of Native people. So I think in terms of understanding opportunities, I would say that since the turn of the last century, our opportunities have risen up out of the soil, if you will, of Native sovereignty, Native self-determination, Indian people's self-determination, to fight the good fight for what they believe to be important: language, culture, ceremony, a way of life, a connection to a landscape. So it may be that that shift or balance between challenges posed by a settler colonial system and opportunities rising up out of the rich resilience of Native peoples, their homelands and their home societies, maybe that shifted a little bit, but certainly in the early 1920s, the challenges were external, the opportunities were internally generated and fought for and created by Native peoples, with some non-Native allies, although personally I think the whole reform movement has been a little overrated in terms of what it accomplished for Native people. That lockdown on Native self-determination continued largely through the Collier administration in the 1930s and the 1940s. It's not till that moment that John and Octaviana started talking about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s that Native people began to push open those doors and windows of opportunity. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Lama, Weima, and thanks to all three of the panelists. So I'm just taking some notes, took a few notes here from Dr. Tippecanoe, your question: what can we do in Indian education if Indian education is a, quote, tragedy, as the Kennedy report seemed to affirm? And what can we do in a university with limited resources? Dr. Trujillo took that up, and the notion that people make a difference. And I'm also struck by Dr. Trujillo, the story that you shared with us about the need to prove the legitimacy, the importance of Indian education research, to be listened to have a seat at the table, to make decisions for our own people. And then Dr. Lama, Weima, you put this in historic context and showed how much had actually been accomplished during that century, but that the opportunities rose out of, as you said, the soil of Indian people's own self-determined efforts. So I wonder if we could take these questions then up to the present moment and look at the landscape of Indian education / Indigenous education today, and just ask you, and if we could have a conversation about a dialogue, that would be just lovely. What would you identify as the greatest challenges in American Indian Indigenous education now, greatest challenges now, and what are some of the greatest opportunities? Where do you see us in this present moment? Anyone?
I'll start. Yeah, I think the greatest challenge, well, there are a number of challenges, and it's difficult to pick a greatest because there's a lot before us that we need to be concerned about and try to do something about collectively. But I go back to where learning takes place. Learning takes place between a teacher and a student. And so I think the challenge, a great challenge that we continue to have is the preparation of educators, the preparation of teachers, that come from an Indigenous American Indian perspective, that have the knowledge on how to work with Indian students, how to take a curriculum and teach a curriculum so it reflects some relevancy what the students are all about. It's a big challenge. They have to be risk takers, they have to be change agents. But I go back to that. And I think an immediate challenge is just the pandemic. How teaching is going on with our students during this time. It's a crisis. Are students really learning? Or is this a wasted year for many students? How are students doing? And how are teachers doing? I hear stories about a lot of stress that teachers have, and teachers are getting out of the field. I think that's part of the history, I think, of Indian education as well. We prepare teachers, do they remain in the classroom? So I go, to me, that's the greatest challenge, is take it down to the student level and the teaching level, and how do we prepare people, and do some analysis of what's going on today.
I think I would echo the same. Right now, the pandemic is just really impacting all our lives. And I think about the parents, I think about the students, and what the community impact is going to be for all the Indigenous families who may be struggling with connectivity, with the internet, for these online teaching mechanisms that we are trying to provide. I think about the challenges of resources again for these families, because of the pandemic, the economic impact, the social, mental health impact of these families. I also think about the broader policy issues. Here we are. What are we still needing to do at the larger public policy as far as providing appropriate salaries so that students want to look at preparing themselves to be teachers, for us to really see teachers as being very, very, very important? I think now that we are in the situation with the pandemic, I think all taxpayers, all communities are saying teachers are vital to our well-being, to children, the learning that's taking place. So what about making sure that they're going to have an appropriate salary for what they contribute to all of us? When are we going to really look at a state curriculum that really provides more understanding of Native American communities, so it's reflected in state curriculum and what is going to be mandated for children to learn about Native communities, Indigenous communities, not only locally, nationally and internationally? I'm a professor of tribal nation building, a professor of applied Indigenous studies. And I can tell you that I teach students that know very little about their neighbors. And these are Arizona residents who know very little about the Navajo, who know very little about the Hopi, who know much less about smaller tribal nations. So it says to me, we have a lot of work to do still.
Well, I guess I'm not seconding, but thirding the concerns and the issues raised by the pandemic. Something that I think concerns us all, and we worry about all the time, is this impact, across all human populations, but the impact on the elderly. For our Native communities, these are our living archives, our living repositories, often, not always, but often our most fluent language speakers. There's just a tremendous wealth of information, knowledge, behavior that is at tremendous risk, even greater risk than usual and the usual risk is pretty high. So I think that's a tremendous challenge right now. I don't really know, but I guess I hope that perhaps a silver lining to the virtual and at-home shift in education that's happening both inside and outside of schools right now might actually be something good for Native communities. That it's pushing some of that opportunity, a little bit of the challenge too, there's no question about that, but it's perhaps opening some possibilities towards people recognizing, remembering, figuring out new ways to handle homeschooling that has been the lifeblood of Native education for millennia. Maybe the pandemic will virtually and in other ways open up some of those possibilities again. Like I say, I don't know for sure, but that's my hope. I'm a historian of schooling, and perversely or paradoxically, I'm not convinced that the current institution of schooling is particularly good for anybody. I'm not sure it serves white students that well. So maybe this is an opportunity to rethink some of those, at this point, very colonial capitalist structures of schools and try and imagine something different. One can hope.
Yeah, let's hope so. I think it's an opportunity to do some analysis of that, to do a research project that looks at and hopefully gets at what you're talking about as well, but also look at what's happening in teaching. When I think of challenges, one real big challenge I think is, how do we deal with what students bring to the classroom? Students come from different kind of situations. Poverty is a real concern in Indian country, and health issues are a real concern. We can go down the line, social issues. There's just a lot that students bring. And are they really ready to learn math and science and English and so forth, when they bring all that to the classrooms? And to me, it goes back to how we prepare teachers. I don't think we prepare teachers very well. I think we oftentimes prepare teachers to have tunnel vision, just to look at their curriculum and what they're teaching and not be too concerned about those other things that students bring to the classroom. We hear the pandemic, is causing mental health issues. To what extent is that true? And our students, are they bringing that? We hear about trauma, historical trauma, and all of that. They bring that to the classroom. We're not prepared to deal with that as educators. That's putting a lot of responsibility on educators. There really needs to be a team approach, but I think it goes back to how we prepare teachers. They have to think holistically, about what students bring with them and how to deal with that, maybe, and look for other resources or how to refer them to other situations and help and so forth. To me, that's really a big challenge.
Octaviana, you have done a lot of work in teacher preparation. I remember when I first met you, you were working for the Tempe Unified School District, and you were developing curriculum and working to get that into classrooms.
Well, Terry, I'm still doing that. I have the privilege to be working with wonderful colleagues and community members from the Tohono O'odham Nation, Tohono O'odham Community College. We have a major grant from the National Science Foundation, and Teresa Newberry is the PI for this big grant that is really providing the funding to really readdress their curriculum and address the STEM fields. Like, how can we really have both Western and traditional knowledge and how students learn math and science and all those STEM fields so that they are better prepared to go to the University of Arizona, ASU, or other institutions of higher learning for their 4-year degree. And we need more of that, but we always work with the very important elders who have the cultural language to provide us with the bridging of Western knowledge with traditional knowledge, to make sure that what we are doing is really in line with those traditional values and ways of knowing. And Pascua Yaqui tribe is also really doing wonderful work around making sure that we continue with language maintenance, language renaissance. It's a little different these days because we're not able to go into the various Yaqui communities to provide that one-on-one collective learning of the Weima language. So it'll be interesting how after a few more weeks, a few more months, because not everyone has internet capability or computers to be able to do the online learning. But I really feel that there is a lot of opportunity with tribal nations to really look at, do we build our own schools in ways that really make sense to us? And of course, we have models for that. We have the tribal colleges and university system, those part of what tribal nations have done in creating tribal colleges, community colleges for their own reservations. But there's also some models there for unique schools and how we learn, how we teach. And I think we need to have an opportunity to do more of that. I think Chanina is correct. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to redesign, rethink, revisit our traditional ways of knowing, how we learn, how we teach. How can the community be very much part of what we build?
That reminds me of the book that Chanina and I worked on together, and I think in the last paragraphs of that book, we returned to a quote by Luther Standing Bear. And Chanina, you can probably remember that quote exactly much better than I can, but where he wrote that, why not an Indian school of thought in our education processes? And he said, I think something to the effect of, the Indian can save America. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, as to add any perspective from that.
Well, John and I just a few minutes earlier were talking about the labor and energy we've invested in our professional careers teaching non-Native students. We've both taught these, introductory level, small to large, some small to very large courses, in the interest of creating better citizens, in the interest of creating and informing potential allies. We need allies. And I think that's kind of a double-edged sword for folks in Indian education and Indigenous studies more broadly. It's like most of us, our primary interest is, not Indians saving America, because that's such a kind of cliched trope of, what kind of traditional primeval values can the disappearing Indian offer to, modern America that we're really not part of. And I don't think many of us are very interested in that, but there is a basic truth there. I think that there is much to be learned from Indigenous epistemologies and Indigenous knowledges that has to start in and benefit Native communities first. And non-Native allies can be instrumental in that process. And Terry, the work that you've done is just, astonishing in the impact that it's had on language policies and language revitalization movements. You're one of the best allies a person could possibly hope or wish for. But I think it's a bit of a slippery slope. And the fact that as we've been talking about resources are scarce, poverty is endemic, and I call it a design poverty. Poverty in Indian country is not accidental. It's federally designed and implemented. Native people know that. Non-Native people, by and large, don't. That's part of our educational mandate. So I think that challenge of a broader education to develop a more general knowledge that of folks out there in the world who know something about and can respect, not just understand, but respect Indigenous sovereignty, and then help to support it as they work in, whatever, municipal, state, federal government, in corporations, funding agencies, whatever. Boy, it's a lot to tackle and still be at that in the trenches point of we have real individual Native students of young ages right now who are being so impacted. How do we help them? I just want to, I guess, I would want to give a shout out to all of the people on this panel who've invested so much of their lives in trying to reach all those different levels and doing it. I mean, that's phenomenal.
And
Well, it's a lifelong endeavor, that Indian educators engage in. It happens every day. I mean, we educate people in and out of the classrooms. We educate people wherever we work. There's still so many stereotypic notions of what Indian people are and what they're all about that sometimes we have to start at the very, very beginning just to try to distill some of those notions that we're not all this way or that way. And it goes on up to just educating people about tribal sovereignty and the powers that sovereignty has, and simple things like here in California, why do Indian tribes have casinos and others don't? Then we get into discussion, a richer discussion as to why. And that goes back to their legal, their political status, but sovereign status that they have as Indian nations, that they can do some things that like casinos, but it starts at the very beginning. But you're right. I think we I have to say also there's some Indian young people who need that kind of education as well. That it might have grown up in a situation where a lot of wasn't a lot of the knowledge or values or culture or language wasn't really given to them, and so we need to educate them too. There are a lot of young Indian people, I think, who have those values that they want to know more about themselves and their people, and they want to help. That sense of community is there. They want to go back. What can I do to help? How can I do this or that? And so it's a challenge, I think, for educators. That's why I think it's very broad, and we just need to have a broad way of thinking to try to give some direction to teachers, the leadership, those people who make policy for us, who don't understand things. There's just it's a big world out there.
Well, I'm just thinking of reasons for optimism. So when Congress passed 1924 and awarded birthright citizenship to Native American Indians, and one of the first challenges to voting rights came out of the state of Arizona, Gila River, Porter v. Hall. Now that had to go through the state courts, and of course the Arizona state courts said, "Do Indians have voting rights?" No way. And it took a couple decades to overturn that, but we have only recently seen in the state of Arizona and elsewhere, the Native vote made a difference.
Yeah.
To me, that's a sea change.
Sure is.
That's hope. That gives me hope and reason for optimism.
And I would be as moderator remiss not to note the important role that the Center for Indian Education has played in policy work, but also in in the preparation of Native teachers. I don't know the numbers. Brian Brayboy can tell us much better what's been happening through the center recently, but hundreds of Native educators, and now with the PhD cohort that you've been working with, Chanina and Brian and others, these things are making a difference. And I go back to your words, John, that it's all about people and the power of people to make that difference, and that it takes place over a period of time of generations even. And this is our generation's time. Is there anything else you want to comment on around these issues? I think people might be curious, speaking of people, who made a difference for you? Who inspired you as a role model or influenced you, and how, and as you were coming up and starting your work, and who's inspiring you now?
Well, I think that who inspired me was my parents. You know, my father was an educator, Comanche. My mother was an educator as a school cook. And they taught in different places, but where I was raised was in New Mexico at the small Navajo reservation, Tahajili. And that was truly a community school. The community was involved just about at every level. But more important than that was my parents had the values, you know, that you should care about people, that you should collaborate with others, that you should respect people for who they are and what they bring, respect languages and cultures, and be responsible. If you're going to say you're going to do something, then do it. You know, so that's when I think of who influenced me initially. And then today, you know, as I've gone through my career and so forth, and working with students are the ones that really influence me now to keep going, because there's so many of them that are doing well. You know, they've accomplished a lot of different things. They've got their degrees. That's a big accomplishment, but they're doing more than that in the field of Indian education. And one thing about that is, as educators, we never know fully what people are doing. We hear it at times. It's a reward that we get when we know someone that we worked with is doing well. I was at a conference one time, I think it was NIEA, and this lady walks up to me and says, "Do you remember me?" And I looked at her and I said, "Remind me." And she said, "I was in your 4th grade class at Tuba City." And she says, "You know what? I'm now president of the school board." I mean, that's the reward, you know, and that's what inspires me, is that students and young people that really want to make a difference and want to carry on the traditional ways and the language and the culture and see the value in it.
Chanina or Octaviana, do you want to add anything?
Well, I agree with John. You know, when I think about my parents did not have any formal education. Maybe they went up to 3rd, 4th grade. Because during that time, you know, they were not required to continue education formally, public education. but they valued education. And it was really my mother that really could see the path for all of us and to be able to make the choices that we wanted to make ourselves, not for the systems or others to make a choice, but that we become self-determined to make the choice that we could have a path to be educated, to make the choices that we wanted to have, whether to go on to the university or to go and have a well-paid career. So it was really my mother. And, you know, I was born and raised in this small village, less than 1 square mile. So it was the village that really helped in the education of what it is to have the collective good, of knowing the language, the significance of the culture, the spirituality, the religion, and to be independent and to never have that identity be eroded by anyone or anything. And many of you know where Guadalupe is. It's still there. It hasn't vanished. It hasn't been pushed aside, even though historically there were policymakers, politicians, and business people who wanted to push aside that little small Yankee community, but it's still there. It's still there and still strong.
Well, I'll be brief. I would just like to say, of course, my professional research began, you know, with the life stories of my dad and what he survived in his life. Chilocco Indian Agricultural School, running away from there, life as a teenager on the Hobo Trail, as the depths of the Depression, World War II, being shot down over Yugoslavia. I mean, he survived so much to be a warm, humane, funny human being, and also to honor my mom, who, you know, came from a very different background, very small rural German Mennonite community. But, you know, somehow their lives and their values meshed. And that made it possible for my sister and me to thrive and imagine things, discover things that we didn't even know were imaginable, like graduate school. What in the world is that? And I just want to say, as a professional, as an early professional in my first faculty position, and one of my very first manuscripts to go out for peer review, I had the great good fortune that it went to John Tipiconic. And speaking of role models, the most generous, the most productive, the most detailed, the most helpful. I mean, it was pages and pages, single space commentary. And not just, this isn't clear, do better, but this isn't clear in how you might do better and sources that would help you do better. I mean, that was a model for professional scholarship that set a very high bar that, you know, showed me the very best of what peer review could be and ought to be, and that I have tried to live up to. So thank you, John.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. We sort of come full circle back to the genealogy, the importance of relationality and all of this. That's been an underlying theme in what's been talked about. The long-term haul, the long-term commitment, and seeing the fruits of that commitment. Your example, John, with the woman who came up to you at the conference. And of course, it would be hard to recognize someone that you last saw when they were in 4th grade. So we're going to turn to the QA in just a minute, but I wonder, colleagues, if in just a short sentence or two, you've talked about what you see as some of the greatest current needs in Indian education, policy, and practice now. And I wonder if in just a few words, you could say what you see as some of the necessary steps to achieve those goals. You've talked about it, and it's been implicit and explicit in some of the comments, but I think it would be helpful to all of us to hear what you see those steps being going forward.
Well, continue working with Native communities, continue working with Native American students who want, helping them to prepare to return back to their home communities to really do tribal nation building. Because it's very rewarding what John has mentioned, that when colleagues mention your students and the kind of caliber of work that they're doing in their communities and how they're impressed with their academic preparation along with that vision and that passion for really working with Native American families, with their communities. It just really it gives you such tremendous honor to have been their teachers.
I agree, that we need to continue and just increasing our involvement and becoming more aware of things. And I wanted to mention a couple of areas where I felt that maybe we could do more in when we talk about Indian education. One of them is working with school boards. School boards supposedly have power. We can argue that at times, but they make decisions locally. And I don't think we have done a very good job in Indian education and preparing or providing training or whatever it might be for school boards. And the second area, I think, is counselors, school psychologists. We really haven't focused on them, yet we know that they do play a major role, in working with students, especially at the high school level, but all levels, but high school level in terms of guiding them towards higher education. So for preparation of counselors, we haven't done that. And then the other thing is just the infrastructure that goes along with schools and what schools are about. I think about, especially in maybe in BIE, but public as well, some of the older facilities, that really need repair, renovation, or just being torn down and have new facilities. I think those are areas that maybe we need to think about more, and as we think about Indian education and where we're going in the future.
Chanina, do you want to?
I have nothing to improve on those comments. I think we should go to Q&A.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, colleagues. That was a wonderful, rich discussion. Leaves us with lots to think about and obviously lots of work to do. We have Dr. Deborah Chadwick from the Center for Indian Education, who will be taking the comments that have been put in chat and in the SST YouTube website. So Dr. Chadwick, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. McCarty. I'll start off first with our questions that have been posted on live, and then go to those that were posted when people registered for this. So our first one is, what is your advice for faculty at PWIs, which I'm assuming is the public white institutes, gaining support in places that historically marginalize Native communities?
So gaining support for Indian education in predominantly white and historically white institutions.
For those faculty people, and I would say our Indigenous faculty, possibly. Yeah.
Well, each of our panelists, all of us have worked and are working in those historically and still predominantly white institutions.
Find your allies, they do exist. Be a good colleague. It gives you really unexpectedly strong social capital at times. Be prepared to work very, very hard as John said, for a lifetime.
Yeah,
Don't underestimate their learning potential.
Yeah, and also have meaningful dialogues. Take the time to think and have dialogues with people. I think dialogues just lead towards more understanding, of where you're coming from. And some people, we just have to write off that they're just not willing to to think about culture and language and the value of it. It's like diversity training at institutions, that I've been a part of too. We just really have a hard time getting people that are in decision-making positions, the deans, or department chairs, to actively participate. When we do have sessions, it's like people that already believe come, and it's like preaching to the choir. So we need to find ways, to get the ear of people and get them to think a little differently about what we're all about and the value of it. And the value of it in terms of what they are doing, the value of it for the institution. Sometimes, we say it's we're bringing students to the institution. So sometimes those people think in terms of numbers, so we also need to think in terms of numbers. And numbers bring resources. Students pay tuition, and sometimes that catches their ear. That can lead towards a discussion, a dialogue later on about the value of what we are doing.
I think all of us have taught courses at major universities that are part of the liberal studies core. Mm-hmm. And so let's hope, because I do know that students have learned from all of us about Native Americans, Native issues, Indigenous peoples, and they can be our future allies, our current allies, in really bringing more of this collective understanding.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to the next question. What role do TCUs have in helping to create more Indian educators, administrators? And then also, how can we create stronger partnerships between TCUs and local universities to push towards this effort?
John, I'm thinking you've been in leadership positions in at least two different TCUs. Maybe you could start.
Yeah. It's I think tribal colleges and universities, I've always said are the best examples, in my opinion, of Indian control of Indian education. It's at their very foundation. So I think they play a major role, in terms of preparing educators, administrators, counselors, people, that come from that kind of perspective, that can work in public education or can work in tribally controlled schools. They play a major role, and they can partner. But I think the university has to be ready for that and has to value, what TCUs, what a tribal college can bring to their university. It has to be one where it's a level playing field, where they listen, where they value, where they respect. I've been involved in situations at major colleges that wanted to work with tribal colleges, and major white institutions that wanted to work with tribal colleges, and some of their attitude was, we can tell them what to do. And that, I said, that's not the approach. Perhaps they can tell us what to do, at a major university. It takes time, it takes dialogue, but I think the outcomes are valuable, and we should continue to try to do that because many of our students, go to the mainstream institutions and to community colleges that are not tribally controlled community college. It takes effort and focus.
I think it's just there have been examples of TCUs working very closely with white higher ed institutions with regards to teacher education. But I think what needs to be done more of and more often is for institutions of higher learning that really want to partner with TCUs, for them to be very, very open to really look at the courses that have already been taken by these students, and to really look at making sure that those courses are going to transfer, are going to be counted toward that teaching degree. And there has to be that understanding and that partnership. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult unless there is that openness and understanding of really having a true partnership between TCUs and institutions of higher learning, four-year institutions of higher learning.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment on what areas of Indigenous education you feel are most pressing, especially areas that we must advocate for as Native scholars/researchers?
Boy, that's a really tough one to answer. I mean, because as I think the panelists have mentioned so far, there's so many pressing issues. I think that maybe is tied to a couple just logistical realities. The first is no one person can do it all. In any of our professions, there's been things that every single one of us had to let go of, even though it was terribly, terribly important. So you have to make decisions. What is it, what's that area that I'm really going to devote my energies to in a way that can make a difference? So I think there's something to an individual decision there of, whether it's environmental education or special education or students in higher ed. Boy, the list is endless. I won't try and even go any further. I think every single one of us has to kind of look to our instincts and look to our inclinations and look to our passions and say, this is going to be it for me, and devote our energies there and realize this is the whole idea of relationality, right? That and the few Native societies that I know anything about in any depth recognize no one person knows it all. No one person does it all. There's like division of labor and division of knowledge and division of responsibility, and the whole works when you know and do your stuff and you rely on your community members, your family members to know and do their stuff. That's what it takes, is that kind of commitment to the whole by lots of different individuals.
Yeah, that's so true. Also given that situations are different. When we look, what do we have? 76 federally recognized tribes in this country, and many others that are not recognized. We think of the diversity that exists between tribes, even within tribes, and think of the language differences, and it's a challenging endeavor. But I agree. I think we just have to take it as an individual decision, what we want to commit ourselves to. A lot of issues.
Debbie, I think we have time for maybe one more question and brief responses, and then we will
move on.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. this is sort of a two-part. Considering the status of K-12 schools as BIE/tribal grant schools / or public schools located in tribal communities, what suggestions do you have for state and federal bureaucracies to work together with these tribes to better serve Indigenous students and create equitable access to resources?
It's another very easy question to answer, right?
Well, I think state and federal bureaucracies need to listen and really hear what's being said by Indian communities and by educators. And I think also, in order to listen better, I think those people that sit in these bureaucracies need to have some sense of what education is all about, and not just an employee that's concerned about compliance issues or other things like that. That have some sense of what education is about and promote it in their interaction with schools and communities. It's a big task. It really is. I don't think bureaucracies are so concerned at times about the quality of education that one receives. They want to try to implement things as they see it. And that's an issue too, because implementation of policy, implementation of legislation always doesn't line up. It can be goal displacement. It takes a different direction when we talk about implementation. So many factors enter into how things are done.
We need a seat at the table, and that's why voting is so important for all of us, right? To have a seat at the table so that we can make those long-term changes and good policy to really help all students.
Yeah, authentic mutual respect, and that is not a trivial thing that's easily accomplished. But as John said, you can't look down and think we're here to help. It has to be authentic mutual respect that leads to deep listening, and then a commitment to actually work together. I don't think many bureaucrats are actually trained to do that. And I don't think it's something, frankly, a lot of our schools train students to do very well, students of any kind. So, it's kind of a circular argument there, but how do we train people to be better listeners and to understand what collaboration means on a foundation of mutual respect? It's actually a very tall order.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time in this first webinar of the series, and I thank you, panelists, colleagues. I don't think there's anything else that I could add to sum things up. One of you said meaningful dialogues, and I think that's the step that we might have landed on. And that's what this webinar series is all about. So I want to let everyone know that our next webinar will be January 22nd, 2021. The theme of it is Building a Legacy of Excellence in Indian Education, and it will feature panelists Dr. Dennis Veery, David Bolio, and myself, and Dr. Lama Weima will have the pleasure of moderating, or we'll have the pleasure of her moderating the panel. It will be a new year with all of its hope and promise. And we hope that you will join us, all of you who are out there right now, and will tell others about it. On behalf of the CIE 60th Planning Committee, I want to express my sincere thanks to our distinguished panelists for this inspiring discussion, and to you, our guests, who have joined in it. We hope to see you in the new year. Take care, be safe, be well. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Adol, thank you.
Thank you. Chokwe Thesia.